Good evening, buenas noches. I'm glad to look out into the audience and see what my daughter calls los miembros de tu tribu, the members of my tribe, particularly, my poeta de cabecera, Andrés Reinaldo, a painter that hopefully my book on him will be coming out soon, Arturo Rodriguez, another painter whose work I respect, Mario Encomo, my good buddy Manuel Perez, and of course Don Ricardo Viera, that he has always been el curandero mayor, as our joke about the word curator. But I have to tell you that emotionally, I also am very, very happy to see my old friend Dr. Vicente Lago, because we go way back to when we were young and we were active in the Abdala movement. So it's really an honor to have Vicente here and his whole family. So let's begin and hopefully have a conversation. Born in Cidra, but brought to the city of Matanzas at the age of 10, Rafael Soriano belongs to the third generation of Cuban modern artists, those born in the decade of the 1920s or early 1930s. This include Agustín Fernández and José Mijares, Roberto Estopiñán and Guy Garcia, Celia Sánchez and Gina Pellón, just to name the leading figures who are among the leading artists of this generation. Like Soriano, they went into exile after 1959. There is no doubt that the betrayal of the 1959 Cuban Revolution and the succeeding dictatorship was the most profound historical trauma for this generation of artists. Exile became for many of them both a painful and a transformative experience that fed and expanded their art. The literary critic Edward Said, who knew something about exile, wrote, and I quote, "Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. It is the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home. Its essential sadness can never be surmounted. All the while, it is true that literature, art, and history contain heroic, romantic, even triumphant episodes in an exile's life. These are no more than efforts meant to overcome the crippling sorrow of estrangement. But it can only be truly overcome through spiritual transcendence." End of quote. This is from Said's Reflections on Exile. Soriano studied both painting and sculpture, while his peers focused exclusively on one or the other, where they were all studying at the San Alejandro Academy of Fine Arts in Havana. This makes Soriano one of the most traditionally and thoroughly trained artists, not just of his generation, but also within the history of modern art in the island, and, I don't doubt saying it, in all of Latin America. A profound and intermediate disciplinary sense of craft is at the very core of his development as a painter. But art making, we know, is the product of a life lived. Soriano was fortunate to have lived the majority of his life with an extraordinary woman, Milagro Soriano, who supported him in every way, from being his friend and lover, partner and mother of their only child, Hortensia, to making the frames for his paintings and collaborating on the titling of his works. We should never take lightly the support system for artists, and having the right life partner is essential. And Soriano definitely had the right one. Rafael Soriano attended the San Alejandro Academy of Fine Arts, graduating in 1941. As an art student, young Rafael befriended two members of the first avant-garde generation, Victor Manuel Garcia and Fidelio Ponce. They both offered him different role models for what artists could be in the Cuba of the time. Because you see, Victor Manuel and Ponce did not have careers as artists, they had vocations. And their pictorial styles ran counter to the established and conventional taste of the time. Ponce's painting in particular, with its mystical dimension and harsh spirituality, would influence Soriano not only stylistically at the beginning, but definitely conceptually, in Soriano's pursuit of what we might call the invisible. And here we can definitely see some of that influence in this early work by Soriano, titled Mujer, Woman, which is obviously also, of course, a head, right? A cabeza. You can see the way he's using the shadows, how the face itself sort of disappears and goes in and out with the actual background of the painting. Throughout the 1950s, like many artists in both the United States and Latin America who were searching for order, for visual clarity, Soriano developed rectilinear, angular compositions charged with strong, flat colors. He joined fellow painters Sandu Darie, Jose Mijares, Martinez Pedro, and others in practicing a geometric and concrete form of abstraction in the island, pintura concreta. What is significant for us to understand is that Soriano's compositions, unlike his contemporaries, are not flat. And just look at this example, because I think you can see that it is evocative of a third dimension within the two-dimensionality of painting. And also in his palette, he showed a preference for warm and intense colors applied in a painterly manner. I believe that Soriano, more than any other artist connected with the concreto aesthetic, understood the lessons of Piet Mondrian. That is, if you think of geometry in the most material surface manner, your painting will be flat and quickly dated. But if geometric order is a means to arrive at something more profound, even spiritual, your pictures will reflect the energetic syncopation of a breathing city, a piece of jazz, or even a gesture of prayer. Had the events of 1959 not altered the history of Cuba profoundly, many of us would not be here tonight, and this, of course, includes Rafael Soriano and his family. Make no mistake about it, as we can see by this example, in the 1950s, Soriano was a very good painter. But in exile, he was transformed into an extraordinary painter. Exile means rupture on many levels. It is the black hole of history, the dark night of the soul for any man or woman that has to experience it and survive it, or better yet, transcend it. Soriano felt all this when he arrived in Miami in 1962. The loss was such that for 2 years, he couldn't paint. Over the years, he stated on numerous occasions in interviews, and I quote, "I came into exile with my wife and daughter in 1962. My uprooting was such that for 2 years, I could not paint." Exile brought about an extraordinary transformation in Soriano's painting. From the mid-1960s through to the 1970s, geometry was dismantled and replaced with a language of forms that synthesize straight lines with more open organic forms and a richer, darker palette, where colors are applied in a modulated manner, defining a shift from light into dark. His compositions acquired a depth where forms were contained while simultaneously shifting, moving, demonstrating that Soriano equally valued form and space thereby establishing a relationship between the two, where the push and pull of the pictorial surface is a constant. And of course, you have the wonderful example from 1970, The Night. Look at how he's juxtaposing the form in the foreground of the picture and how it works in relation to the sky in the background. But it's important to understand that the creation of space in these works is also metaphorical. They are open areas endowed with a sense of both displacement and longing, of an open-ended journey, which are the spiritual conditions of any exile. By the mid-1970s, Rafael Soriano had achieved his mature vocabulary of biomorphic, luminous shapes existing in an atmosphere of mystery, which evoked otherworldly concerns. And he would work consistently in this manner, expanding his vocabulary as a painter until he ceased to paint in the year 2000. And of course, this is the wonderful Surcos de Luz, which is in the collection of the Lowe Museum. And again, look at the relationship between foreground and background, and the fact that you have the element of light coming from the darkness towards the front of the pictorial surface. Because this whole issue of the relationship between light and dark not only shows us his great technical abilities as a painter, but the actual visual language that he's proposing to communicate the ideas in his paintings. And this is one of my favorite works of his from the early 90s, El Descanso del Héroe. And you start to see this very specific way in depicting transcendence, because it is not a literal, illustrative way of depicting the figure. It is a very poetic and evocative way of giving a representation of the figure, the sense of a long journey, the evocation of a mythic world, that the hero has completed that struggle and now is finally at peace and able to let go and be at rest. Among Soriano's most figurative works throughout his entire career are a series of heads that he painted from the late 60s right through the 1990s, which is, of course, the subject of the exhibition downstairs. So we're going to look at some of these works specifically. And of course, if you haven't seen the exhibition, I urge you to please take the time to come and see the paintings, be in relationship with the paintings, because his work really demands the direct contact of really spending time looking at the paintings. Head of a Mystical Queen from 1967 possesses a geometric, almost cubist language which defines a massive head in a palette of greens, browns, and blues. But what I want you to understand is that if we look at a typical cubist painting, those paintings are very much about form and disruption on the surface. What he does is he takes that language and again he brings into it this idea of light coming through the shapes and in effect redefining the shapes in a not solidly materialistic manner. Okay? And then next to it, you have the magic necklace, which has a very surreal armor-like shape that defines the head and the shoulders beneath a series of minimal multicolored stripes. So I think you can see that these are transitional works. He is going back and forth with experimentation of pictorial languages, and you see a reflection, obviously, in the magic necklace of some of his geometric work in the flat color stripes in the background. In both the Prophet and the Virgin, he's going back and forth, purifying the remnants of geometry, achieving an organic simplicity in browns, purples, grays, and blues, where elemental shapes evoke the figures of a prophet with a mantle, and of course the Mother of God with her halo. And I think what's also fascinating is his use of an abstract visual language to explore the possibility of a modern art with an authentic religious subject matter. Okay, not just using religious subject matter for the sake of the modern art, but actually the other way around. Using the modern art in the search of a authentic religious subject matter. And it's something that, I'll come back to later on. The head, with its obvious representation of humanity, becomes to Soriano's brush a vessel, a mirror, and of course a questioning metaphor of meaning. The complete elimination of geometry is evident in the surrender. Here, an encounter of soft horizontal forms create two heads touching in profile. And as we're looking at it, I want you to think that more than just an embrace of lovers, we can also interpret this work as the soul and God, as in San Juan de la Cruz notion, where the soul surrenders unto God as if to a lover. And again, look at the palette. It's a palette of incredible subtlety. Okay? It's a variation of browns, pinks, and purples with these slivers of this warm, almost golden color that defines the shape. Okay? And I will keep using the word subtlety because that is essential in really understanding his work. Okay? This is not an artist that is just going to do something 1, 2, 3. The fact that he is very much a process-oriented artist with this incredible sense of craftsmanship, he is communicating that in what he demands of us as viewers. Okay? That we have to really take our time to really understand all of those subtle elements in his work. The plenitude of Soriano's pictorial powers can be seen in a major work like Head of a Slave. One evening, the artist called his wife Milagros to the studio and showed her the beginning of this painting on the easel. He said, "Mira lo que está saliendo. Look what is coming out." It is a figure consisting of a head, neck, and shoulders that twists and turns as it looks up. Light defines the golden flesh tones against a dark gray background. The man is depicted in the moment when he has achieved an awareness and he's about to rebel against servitude. All of the forms are sculptural in their definition, projecting a sense of movement that seems to push out of the pictorial plane. In contrast to the work next to it, a pessimistic work like Orozco's Slave, right, where you see it's almost like the figure has completely disappeared under the chains and the keys. We can see that Soriano's painting, in his rebellious gesture, is a much more life-affirming pictorial statement. Powerful heads continue to come forth from Soriano's brush throughout the 1990s. His homage to Nicolás de Cusa is a massive figure that represents tradition and resistance. It is painted in this exquisite orchestration of pale pinks and purples with touches of silver and gray. Soriano boldly defines the head and shoulders of this German theologian and astronomer, an early proponent of humanism before the Renaissance. And although he does not literally paint the skull, cap, and the cape of a cardinal, he evokes his spiritual strength and authority through the abstract forms that create the body. And again, pay attention to the projection of light. In this particular painting, the light is being projected from the interior of the figure towards the surface to the viewer. Portrait of an Intellectual represents an overwhelmingly cerebral figure to an enormous bluish purple head resting on what seemed like neutral brown shoulders. This head is expressively evocative, avoiding a descriptive, literal representation of eyes, nose, and mouth. But as you keep looking at it, I want you to start seeing that instead what we can discern are figures, fragments of what could be landscapes, even objects. These are the ones that form the so-called features. Jorge Luis Borges' seminal text comes to mind. A man spends his entire life drawing a large map. When he is finished and stands back, he recognizes a self-portrait in the Orwell design. It is the mystery of the self, visible through the face, the head, which reflects the baggage of life, other people, places, memories. The weight and burden of intellect is also exquisitely and painfully captured by Soriano in this painting. In The Patriarch and the Seer, the artist created monumental, serene figures. They are like mountains that have weathered an incredible storm, and where the passage of life, with its joy and suffering, has made them stronger, wiser. These possess what we might define in a Jungian sense as an archetypal presence. The seer, a Sibyl-like matriarch. The patriarch, the head of an ancient tribe. The notion of tradition, continuity. And always remember that great line by W.H. Auden, that what is tradition but the democracy of the dead? And yet, Soriano is not afraid to wrestle with difficulty, pain, even horror in a direct manner in some of his paintings from the 90s. In Bewitched Head, with its blues, pinks, and purples, the agony of bewitchment is captured. The figure pulls back as it struggles with a scarf-like form that strangles its neck. A dark, cold Prussian blue surrounds and consumes the head. What is significant in an agonizing image such as this one is that there is still no choice but to struggle against the darkness. It is not about accepting the darkness, but to be in perpetual rebellion against it. The Anguish of Oblivion is one of Soriano's most disturbing works. It is constructed with passages of shifting whites, grays, and yellow ochre. It depicts the anxiety brought forth by the loss of remembrance of both the self and the homeland, la patria. The shapes that form the head and upper torso are convulsed fragments of perhaps a hill, a valley, a road, people. Memory is both the beautiful and painful content of exile. Losing it means the loss of being. This figure struggles, twisting and turning in its spiritual anxiety. in certain late works such as this one, Soriano captures transcendence as a paradox, charged with doubt and tension. But in this tension, there is ultimately a letting go, a release, a being opened to some kind of liberation. He basically leaves that as an open pictorial statement for us as the viewers. From its very beginning, Rafael Soriano's pictorial production had a spiritual, meditative, and metaphysical dimension. After his painful exile, and from the 1970s on, this aspect of his work became more than ever the central route for the development of his vision as a painter. The head or face, with its evocation of humanity and its inner life, served him well as a vehicle for this exploration. Let us recall, of course, St. Augustine saying that the face is, of course, the mirror of the soul. These pictures express deep existential concerns regarding freedom, identity, and the desire to convey a sense of the real that goes beyond the material. They suggest struggle, rescue, and salvation, and the individual's perpetual need for both identity and freedom. All throughout Soriano's pictures, we see a transcendent concern. The more powerful because it evokes the mystery of being. Soriano's paintings, not just the Cabezas pictures, paintings of heads, are all meditative moments where elusive, biomorphic forms move within this fantastic space, these fantastic spaces, projecting a journey of mythic proportions. His diaphanous color, always shifting and fluid, has the ability to emotionally suggest a universe of struggle and victory, of rescue and salvation. After looking at his paintings for a number of years, spending a great deal of time looking and then being able to see, because I think it's essential for you to understand that that's the key to not just Soriano's work, but the work of any substantial painter. You start by looking, but then what has to take place is seeing. You have to go beyond the immediate superficial aspect of looking, and you start to actually see the work. A number of things have become very clear. The idea that you have to, as a viewer, surround yourself by his work, spend time in front of it so that this process takes place, and that you have to visually surrender yourself to the pictorial experience. Amidst the struggle and beauty of Soriano's paintings, its mystery and possibilities remind me of the lines by T.S. Eliot from the last of the four quartets, Little Gidding. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Thank you.
It's incredible that you can explain everything in a process incredible.
Oh, what's incredible is his work. You know, the one good thing about being an art historian is that ultimately you always have to be humble, because if the artists aren't doing the work, there's nothing you can do, right? And I always like to say that you interpret the work always respecting the artist's intention. And the intent, and you know what's wonderful about Soriano, and it's interesting because earlier today when I was speaking with Mario and Como,
the lights of the effect to the touch.
Oh no, the light is essential. It's the ongoing theme throughout his pictures, right? And it's the method that he uses. But I was saying to Mario and Como that what has always moved me about his work is that Soriano, as a person, those of you who had the privilege of meeting him, was a very modest man, but he was also a very intuitive artist. Like, he knew things happened, but he didn't go into a big explanation. These things just happen. And then you have other artists who are much more intellectual and rhetorical and can explain the work. But his humility in accepting that things happen and that he was just being open to that process taking place, I think it's a really terrific example. Come on, this is Miami. You guys have to have plenty of things to say. And you can ask the questions in Spanish too, and I can go back and forth between the language.
Do you have the opportunity to grasp what is how much of Soriano's is appreciated in our country, in Cuba now, the museums and everything? What has happened to Soriano's work?
You know what I think is interesting is that in the last, I guess it's been the last 12 or odd years, give or take, there has been a process, and actually you could, if you want to be very specific in terms of political dates, after 1989, right? Part of rewriting the narrative, right, was a re-encounter with a certain nationalistic fervor, right? And so all of a sudden, artists who in Cuba had been not just forgotten, but they had been censored. I can tell you, for example, the work of Soriano, the work of Agustin, the work of Roberto Topiñán, the work of Mijares. For years, those paintings had been removed from the galleries of El Museo Nacional, and they were in storage. But since then, they have been bringing the work out. They have done restoration, and they have made those works visible. And so I think, and we have to be sober about this, right? Of course, there's always a political agenda. But I think it's a great opportunity in the sense that the art is more powerful than all their political agendas. And so they have to realize a big piece of the history we didn't have access to it, and now all of a sudden we can see it. So I think that's what I have been able to perceive of what has been going on in recent years.
I think it's a good opportunity. You're giving this excellent lecture, and I would encourage our chairman, Mr. Felipe, the chairman, to take the lecture and somehow make it reach the Cuban people and those who very much love Soriano's work in the island.
And I also think it's important that, I have no problem with that, but Vicente, I would also add that what's significant about this generation of artists, as well as the wonderful contemporaries that we have here among us, like Arturo and Mario and Demi, is that what makes this work so rich historically is that it exists on many levels. Because yes, they are part of Cuban art, they're part of Cuban American art, right? They're part of contemporary American art, right? So all of these multiple aspects of identity also need to be explored and embraced, because he is a part of the art of the United States too. And I think that's something also that has to be acknowledged. We don't, part of what's great about these artists is their universality. Right? And because, those of us who believe in pluralistic and open societies, we understand, right, that one thing does not negate the other. It's important for them, for them to understand what they haven't been told, right, the history that has been erased or denied or censored, and then to see them in the larger context of contemporary art. Because when I look for, let's just focusing on Soriano. Soriano is doing work with the same concerns as Mata in Chile, as Tamayo in the 50s and 60s, as Fernando de Cislo in Peru, as the early work of Armando Morales in Nicaragua, and also think of the commonalities with great New York painters, Mark Rothko, William Basiores. I mean, there's a lot of different crossroads, right, where we can see all of these artists being part of a larger dialogue about what painting is, and also painting that is about important inner things. So, but no, I think I'm fine with, you know, I always think it's a good thing to almost look at promoting the work of certain artists almost as a kind of evangelical thing, and I'm not an evangelical. I'm still, for whatever reasons, I'm still a Catholic. Okay, but in the sense that it's about spreading the information, you know, the importance of the work. So,
Work for freedom.
yeah. Mario.
I left Cuba in the 60s when I was a kid, and I went back to visit in 1996, and I immediately went to the museum there at the Havana, and they had an incredible exhibition of concrete art, and I was blown away with Soriano's work and Mijares' work.
Mijares was an
was
extraordinary concrete
blown
painter.
away. As a kid, I was like, the quality of the works that the museum has is incredible. Those that I saw in 1996, and I was even surprised that they were showing their work. But it was another way of looking at Mijares,
Yeah,
all
exactly.
together. So I think that the opportunity could work both ways.
Well, and I think it's important to understand that, you know, there's this larger narrative, right, which is
They are Cuban artists.
yeah, and that the large narrative is that Cuba was one of the central places for the development of modern art in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, when you look at that, you know, you're talking, it's Mexico,
Yeah.
it's Buenos Aires, it's Sao Paulo, it's Montevideo and Havana.
Yeah.
You know, those were the places. Everything that needed to happen when it came, and I'm just talking about painting for now, or visual art, it happened in these cities basically from the 1920s on. So there was this long trajectory of incredibly innovative work that took place.
And they were at their early, I was just blown away by the work. It was like an eye opener for me over there. It was like, oh my God, look at Mijares.
Well, and I think particularly in Mijares, we are so familiar with the work that he did in exile, right?
Yeah.
The stylized figures. And I think some of those can be wonderful, but then some of them can also be repetitive and mechanical.
Of the work.
But when you see how ahead he was in
Yes.
defining abstraction in the 50s, yeah, it's really extraordinary work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come on. Guys, you know, I feel like a stand-up comic in the Catskills. You know? You got to work with me, people. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I want to commend you on your efforts and the efforts of Hortensia and what she's doing to make sure that not only we remember the legacy of this great painter, but also to make sure that it permeates all cultures in the contemporary art market. I think they're doing a great job, along with my colleagues behind me. The Cidra family, which is doing a great job. When we talk about contemporary art, they're really focusing on artists, and I think they're doing a very good job. I want to tell you a little story about why I'm here today. I'm here today because I was exposed to this gentleman's work as a result of my parents at a very young age. We used to visit Soriano's home probably on a monthly basis. My father would visit them as a physician, and I got exposed to Milagros and Maestro on many occasions. My brother, my sister, and would bring friends along. And the experience, you do him very good justice, but there's nothing like sitting in his home, in his studio, and listening to this humble individual who was a giant, even though his stature was maybe, what would you say?
5'5", maybe, on a
5'5".
good day.
He was patient. He was an individual who was an intellect. He was exceptionally talented. He always opened up his home to anybody that wanted to talk about art, that wanted to talk about politics, and he loved his country. And those are memories that will stay with me forever. And that's why when I would ask my father, why do you continue to buy Soriano's work over and over and over again? He has works by Cundo, he has works by Mijares, he has works by Carlos Enrique, Carlos Alfonso, but why is your collection predominantly Soriano? And his response was always very simple and to the point. It's what I like. It's what I like. And my mother and my father, you know, to this day, this is what they like. This is what brings them so much joy, and it's wonderful to see him get the attention that he so sorely deserves at a national and an international level. So I congratulate you, and I wanted to make sure I just made some some comments to Hortensia and to everyone here who's putting in the artists in the back, the collectors, the intellects, people who are pushing his legacy forward. I just wanted to say thank you.
No, thank
you
you
for that
your
work.
comment.
Thank you.
And you know what I would add is that I think at this point, I'm sure many of you are aware that starting in 2011, there have been 2 major national shows, and then this wonderful, smaller, more focused show that has been traveling across the country. And what's interesting is the consistency of the reaction of the diverse audiences to the encounter with the work. And I have a good feeling that I think in the next 6 to 10 years, it's even going to continue. I think his work will be able to see it integrated in larger museum exhibitions and see him in the larger context of contemporary art. And I agree with you about the powerhouse sitting behind you, those two who have a great eye. And it's not just because they represent artists that I think are terrific, like Arturo, Mario, and Como, but they do have a great eye.
They do a very good job.
But the whole thing of access, when you meet an artist, is so important. I'll tell you guys an anecdote, maybe that'll warm you up to ask me some more questions. I met Soriano when I was 19. Okay? I was a kid. Believe it or not, your dad knows me earlier than that. Porque yo estaba tirando piedra a los 16 años when I was in Abdala. And I was fortunate to go visit him with 2 friends of mine who were the nephews of Jose Gomez Sicre, who I'm sure all of you know, this very influential art critic, and with Gomez Sicre, and with one of my favorite people in the history of Cuba, the novelist Enrique Labrador Ruiz. And we went to the studio, and again, with this incredible modesty, the young kids, we wanted to see paintings, and Rafael Milagro just kept bringing out paintings, and we were just looking and looking and looking. I remember that he was working on Surco de Luz, on the easel. We must have been there over 2 hours, right? Almost 3 hours. And of course, Gomez Sicre, the professional art critic, is going on and on and on and on. And so it's time to go, and Labrador, has been just looking and not saying anything. And I'm sure those of you who speak Spanish will forgive my profanity, because you cannot tell a story about Labrador Ruiz without some profanity. And so when Gomez Sicre finished saying, Rafael es un pintor extraordinario, Rafael is an extraordinary painter, he went on for several minutes. And of course, the 3 of us turned to see what Labrador had to say. And Labrador, who I'll never forget it, and there's a photo, right, that shows him wearing a blue guayabera. It was like this. Cojones, esto es pintura. I'm sure I don't need to translate that. But it's about the immediacy, the power of the work, and that it connects. I mean, you like it because it comes from a deeper thing, and that's obviously the reason why your parents have collected so much of his work, because they like it, they love it. That's very important, that kind of connection.
It's true.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank Hortensia.
Yeah, that's the first person that should be thanked.
Yes, because she's keeping the legacy of her father going on. And children need to see this. And I want to thank you for doing such an extraordinary job in expressing the the work, of Soriano. You had mentioned in reference about jazz, and as a vocalist, I studied jazz and opera, and studying the theory of classical music, European classical music versus American music. There is a mind-blowing when it comes down to jazz. Your mind just blows, and then you get to understand why Miles Davis, John Coltrane were the way they were. I could see that in Soriano. From the time period of the techniques that he was painting with geometry, all the way down to that trajectory of spiritualism. Because I can see the spiritualism, the way that he mixes the circle of fifth in music. He mixes the melancholic, the darkness with the light, but the light is always more prevalent in his paintings, because even in the darkness, like the one of the ancestors, even in the darkness, he has that light there. And it's just incredible the way that in her face, in the middle, you can see, I see a heart with an artery. It's just to me, he's my favorite painter. And it's unfortunate that I never got to meet him, but it's a blessing that I meet his daughter. And I wanted to ask you, when he was painting and these great paintings, did he listen to music? And if he did, what kind of music did he listen to?
All kinds of music, all kinds of. He would listen to jazz, classical, tribal music, electronic music,
Really?
all kinds of music, every kind of music you can imagine. And I always would fall asleep to some kind of music, and sometimes it was pretty weird music. But I was always comforting, to know that I knew he was at his most happiest back there painting when the music was going. I knew he was painting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and a conversation you and I were having earlier today is that Soriano was also a great dancer. He loved to dance.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Pete Mondrian was also a great dancer who loved to dance. So think of also this notion of the sense of space and your relationship to space as your body moves in space, and how that is also reflected in the creation of pictorial space.
Yes. I can see more space than time, really, actually, in his paintings.
Well, and it's the idea of communicating time through space.
Through space, yes, exactly. Thank you.
Someone else.
Voy a decir en español
Por supuesto, yo te contesto en los idiomas
que
posibles.
hay algo en él que es superior, porque cuando él integra en su pintura todo lo que él expresa, todo el mundo se puede encontrar de alguna manera ahí, aunque uno no sepa de pintura, aunque uno no sepa de cosas, de la técnica que usó o que no usó. Hay algo que se transmite y que es sobre la persona humana y el vínculo con Dios. Es lo que yo siento.
Yo quiero también, bueno, si me permiten en español.
Claro, claro.
Hay una realidad que también a mí por lo menos me ha impactado mucho en Soriano, y es la siguiente. Como bien dice Alberto, es algo que impacta a todo tipo de personas, como sea. Pero yo llevo, por ejemplo, muchísimos años trabajando con tratar de trabajar en la persona para llegar a la interioridad de la persona.
Psicólogo.
Es lo más difícil, es muy difícil. Uno tiene que estar años trabajando en eso y no llega uno a satisfacerse del todo, porque no llega a ser el bien total, porque es muy difícil. Y la pintura de Soriano es capaz de llegar a la interioridad así, con un sas. Es increíble cómo puede llenar, todo se mueve por dentro de uno, ya sea una persona que sepa sobre pintura, como que no, que esté preparado, no, los colores, las luces, todo.
Las formas humanas están ahí detrás.
Y hay algo que es muy sanador, porque siempre que algo interno se mueve, sana. Y es sanador de por sí, de manera natural y espontánea. Es algo muy especial.
La diferencia sería en el trabajo que nosotros hacemos a veces, es las personas creyentes que crean un Dios, que oran por lo que uno les está dejando ver, ya en ellos se ve un avance mayor. Pero las personas que no tienen ese feeling espiritual, se les hace más difícil.
Pero de todas maneras llega.
Pero esto es superior porque es visual y llega.
Llama la atención que él muestra su vida con un testimonio, todo el proceso de su vida, y es capaz de mostrar su vida y lo más importante, su muerte. Es decir, es como si él hubiera vivido el cielo, lo hubiera traído aquí a la tierra y lo hubiera podido mostrar a través de su pintura. Es asombroso.
Estoy completamente de acuerdo.
Asombroso.
For those of you who don't know Spanish, in
Sorry.
essence, y voy a dar una versión
esencia, claro.
en esencia, what they were saying is that even if you do not have an understanding of the rules of pictorial construction or of art, that his art communicates directly, no matter who you are, what your background, it just has this ability to communicate. And I agree completely. And it's interesting because when I said, and I was hoping to bring this up in the question and answer period, and I said, I'll come back to this when I said those earlier religious, and his attempt at doing an authentic modern art with religious subject matter. And this goes back, and the thing is that he has a series of pictures, even earlier from the 50s, that are actually in the bishop's house in Matanzas, of the Holy Family done in this kind of way, in the 1950s, right? And there's a couple of ideas that I want to bring up to make you think about it. In the early part of the 20th century, the great Russian abstractionist and believer, Vasily Kandinsky, was very much affected by the ideas of a psychologist, Wilhelm Waringer, and this notion of art and empathy. And so what Kandinsky read in Waringer was that abstraction, as opposed to being a closed system, is an open system that becomes accessible to people that don't even know anything about art. Because it takes away any requirement, right? So I think Soriano very much fits into that kind of sphere. And then the other thing that I find fascinating too is a book that I highly recommend for any of you interested in painting and notions of spirituality, is a book from 1949, and it's a series of lectures given by the French Thomas philosopher Etienne Gilson. He gave them at the National Gallery in Washington. They were part of the Mellon Lectures. And the book is called Painting and Reality. And Gilson proposes, and this, right after the war, right? So think the state of the world. Gilson says the following: the human figure has been so disfigured by the horrors between World War I and World War II that working with the human figure can only be possible in two ways. One is in a very expressionistic manner, or moving away from the figure and through an abstract language, trying to forge a new spiritual language. So he thinks this out in 1949. And I think Soriano also connects with that.
Mientras más espiritual esté cerca de la verdad espiritual, a más personas puede llegar. Eso soy yo.
I don't disagree.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Just one quick one.
Sure.
I have to ask you. So in your research, you just mentioned a name that Lisa and I have been certainly analyzing when we look at Soriano's work, which is Rothko. And in your time with him or in any interview, did he ever mention Alvarez's influence in his work?
I have not found any written comment of that. But here's what's important to keep in mind was that the work of Alvarez and his teaching was known in Cuba in the 50s. Because you have to understand that not only was Cuba a highly sophisticated artistic environment, but also Gropius visited Cuba and spent several weeks in Cuba. And so there was that connection with the Bauhaus. So I would guess that he clearly had an awareness, and he was an educator. So.
Yeah, 'cause I love the color theory, the technique, and that effect, psychological effect.
And here's what I think is fascinating in that connection that you make. Albert's, particularly Homage to the Square pictures, which I'm sure you've all seen in one way or another, you know, it was made into a stamp a number of years ago. Albert's is trying to evoke a fourth dimension, but I don't think he quite gets there.
No.
And Soriano gets there. So,
Deeper.
and you know, and this is not one of those. But my wife, who is Polish and Czech, tells me, "Is that one of your Cuban moments?" No, this is not a Cuban moment. This is just looking at the evidence of the pictures. Albert is really working hard. I mean, he does over 200 paintings just on that interrelationship between squares and a variation of colors. But he can't quite create that sense of dimensionality, and Soriano does it. Yeah, no, these pictures are extraordinary from the 50s too. Final question, comment? So the most important thing, the exhibition is up through early April. Come back and see it again, tell your friends about it. He's an extraordinary painter, and it's important that people know that he's an extraordinary painter and see the work.
Is it going to be open now? No. Will it be open now?
I think the director can answer that better than me.
I guess after this lecture, we should all go back down and do
Yeah, of course.
Thank you all.